We try to engage in a whole series of ways. Every time we learn a new lesson, we effectively try to set up a program to address it, so that we're now working in a huge spectrum of interventions. We work on public financial management. In other words, we're working with ministries of finance and others to improve the technical policy environment. We work with the World Bank and others on macroeconomics, trying to make sure that currencies are stable, trying to make sure that exchange rates are regulated. We work on particular sectors. We have a huge program in agricultural development, trying to build small agricultural businesses to scale through AgDevco. We work on infrastructure with the World Bank through something called Pitch. We work on the trade environment. We've got a huge program through Trade East Africa. We've just put another £300 million into Trade East Africa. And why do we do this? We do this in order to do very practical things, to work on ports in Tanzania, to work on reducing delays at borders between East African countries. We also, of course, have just put an additional £4 billion into CDC, which, as we've heard, is a very unique type of public risk capital, which attempts to make sure that we go into places the private sector might be reluctant to go into, that we have longer time frames. We don't need such a quick return. We can offer lower interest rates in order to really give African businesses an opportunity. The question is one of the commitment of the state towards economic development, and that provided that commitment is there, a very wide variety of economic models are possible. There are successful examples from Ethiopia and Rwanda of state-driven economic development. There is, of course, a successful example in Kenya of a much more liberalized private sector-led type of economic development. The point is not exactly what the macroeconomic theory is. The point is the state committed to that? And again, the obstacles to that, we tend to frame in terms of words like corruption or politics. But we don't really know what this means because, of course, one of the other uncomfortable lessons of the last 30, 40 years of economic development is, of course, there are countries, even in East Asia, which have succeeded in developing quite dramatically, notwithstanding corruption. There are countries that have developed notwithstanding political problems. So it's a more specific issue. It's a specific issue of what is the nature of this corruption in this particular place. And when we talk about politics, not really a question of political will or political leadership or, to use this horrible jargon term, capacity building. No, it's not that kind of problem. It's very tempting looking from the outside to say the problem is leadership. But actually that isn't the problem. The problem is politics in a much deeper sense of power. It's the way in which the entire state is structured. It's the way in which parties operate. It's the way in which the priorities are expressed right the way down to a local level. These are the things which have proved to be the barrier. And which mean when all of us travel around Africa, we discover certain bewildering circumstances. I often find, for example, in conversations with young entrepreneurs, that the first 25 minutes of my conversation are extremely optimistic. The first 25 minutes, I always feel, this is amazing, this country's taking off, there's all these young people, the entrepreneurs are really happy. Towards the end of my lunch with the entrepreneurs, everything begins to get a bit depressing as they begin to talk about the individual problems they face in their businesses. They begin to talk about the problems of finding skilled workers. They begin to talk about the problems of getting bank loans. They begin to talk about the actual problems of getting certification from the government. And one recent conversation I had in a foreign trip ended with them having begun saying this is the most amazing economic potential in the world, saying to me in a rather depressed way, I'm not sure if I had my own money overseas whether I'd really be investing in this market as opposed to investing in Dubai. Right? We may need to be better at acknowledging that there is not some kind of East Asian model which everybody has to follow. It's a deeply tempting thought because of the incredible success of East Asia, but it underestimates the very profound differences in terms of the history, the state-building history of Africa compared to East Asia. And in particular, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that in addition to the question of the commitment of the state towards economic development, in other words, the kind of commitment displayed in Rwanda or Ethiopia, there is also an interesting question in many African states which don't have the state history. Reach out, I think, as an international community more to taking a positive, constructive, relationship, as a critical friend to the kinds of investments that come in from places like China and India. It's a fact. The private sector. Clearly the only way we're going to follow the great cliche that keeps being generated, turn billions into trillions, turn the kind of money that our organization, the Department for International Development, spends into the kind of money that could potentially be spent by the City of London and other financial institutions, is by getting the private sector in. This, again, involves us not reacting as officials with suspicion and horror. Of course, things can go wrong. And indeed, many people in the public sector will be quick to point out some of the problems of private capital coming in too quickly. People are worried that it's too easy now to go to the bond market. They're worried about what the loans are being used to pay for, often recurrent staff costs. They're worried about questions of corruption. But there's no point burying our head in the sand or being negative about this. No, we need to invest in the people who are investing, and we need to invest in the people who are receiving that investment. We need to create a proper partnership with the private sector where we accept the reality that many hundreds of billions are going to flow into Africa, and think about how we make sure that goes in a way that works for African economic development and works for those investors. So on that, I'm going to conclude. Firstly, on the idea of humility, on the idea that we don't have all the answers here, that the solutions will be generated from Africa, that those solutions will be quite different country to country. The solution that Ethiopia produces may be different from Rwanda, the solution that Rwanda produces may be different from the solution that Kenya produces. That the question of the commitment of the government to economic development is almost more important than anything else, that needs to be paired with the question of consent. How do you keep a population on side? And the nature of that consent in Africa will in many cases be quite different from the kind of consent that you would be looking for in East Asia, and the kind of political system you would develop would probably be quite different to an East Asian system, but ultimately it's up to Africans themselves to determine what that can be. And finally, that we, in the West, need to be much more positive, much more open to working with unconventional partners, to working with China, to working with India, to working with the private sector, and thinking not about the downsides of those investments, but what the potential upsides could be.
Set in the climate of a massive downturn in the Nigerian economy, there was real ambition and a consciousness of that ambition. They talked about we, and they talked about ourselves, and they had a sense of leadership. There's a strong sense among Nigerian entrepreneurs that they carry their own future and they will be determinant of their own future. The business landscape holds many, many examples of business people directly competing with large and established companies and taking market share, from supermarkets to hotels to construction. Those views show real vigor, local entrepreneurs matching investments from overseas. And I met Chinese businessmen, more than one, who said that China hadn't secured a significant foothold in Nigeria because they couldn't compete. And that's in strong contrast to the experience in many other African countries. They all said that the harsh economic environment was a good thing, which surprised me, because it meant the end of easy money. It stemmed the capacity of people in the oil-funded money stream to simply dominate in business because they had the backing. In other words, they said that the playing field now is much more level without oil than with oil. And the slower, more constrained economy meant more rigor, more caution, and more care in developing the kind of bankable businesses that they and we would like to see.
But also I think it's important to mention well-known factors that have nevertheless to be taken into account, which is the whole issue of education in terms of access to education, the quality of education itself, and certainly vocational training in the many sectors of the economies of the countries. In the Zambian and the other economies of the region were in the 90s faced also, as we well know, with many challenges and difficulties which were brought about by the fall of commodity prices globally and also several hardship situations at home, as we know. And in Zambia specifically, the reforms necessitated by this situation significantly reduced the scope of the public sector, with greater emphasis being put on the role of the private sector for economic development. When I was in Zambia, many of the categories of people and institutions, I forgot to mention research institutions also, Zambians, and regional research institutions on issues of economic development and the role of the private sector, were affirming that in the case of Zambia, practically since 1991, the openness to acknowledge the importance of the role of the private sector in development was there, unlike perhaps in other countries where this came a little bit later. What perhaps was not so much there was how governments, successive governments then took up the role of taking care of the enabling environment, coming together and engaging the private sector, and this also as far as big direct foreign investors in Zambia. Where are the Zambian SMEs, small and medium enterprises, in terms of being part of the value chains of the big companies? What has happened to those small and medium and micro enterprises during times not just of low, but also of high, of the prices of copper, for example, in Zambia. So the various actors in development took up their role, and this is an important question that I came across again and again. One of the major difficulties for the upscaling of SMEs in many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are the shortcomings of the implementation of economic, monetary, financial policies that can bring about growth, which is inclusive, which create jobs, etc. The third point I wanted to make very quickly, the way forward. So development actors are increasingly engaging with the private sector. For example, if we take the example of the compacts, the business compacts of the 90s and the noughts, between, for example, the UN and big businesses that many of us know. Even the case of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals before, this aspect of the partnership, the public-private partnerships to resolve domestically issues of job generation, provision of basic social services, and so on and so forth, was very prominent. When we talk about policy recommendations also in the report, it's not just in relation to the governments and their ability to create these sustainable environments, sustainable loans for the smaller entrepreneurs and all the things that we know, but it's also for the big investors and big corporations. Let me end by saying that the case has been well made, if indeed there was any need to make the case further, for encouraging greater direct foreign investment and business partnership in Africa, which in turn should include strategies to accelerate the inclusion and upscaling of the SMEs.
One of the things I want to talk about is entrepreneurship. SMEs, we know, are the lifeblood of every economy, and in Africa in particular. SMEs create jobs. So if we are talking about jobs, we need to talk about SMEs. And today's SMEs can become the behemoth of tomorrow. So it's important that we get it right at this level. For Africa, it's very, very critical. If you look at the population and the fact that we don't have many companies on the continent that have done very well. In Africa, to put it in a proper context, you have just about 700 companies on the continent with annual revenue that's in excess of $500 million. And just about 400 with annual revenue that's in excess of $1 billion. So we need to grow more big companies. And to grow more big companies must start from the small-scale businesses. And these small-scale businesses, if and when supported properly, can help us as a continent. I long realized this personally, and I'm happy that when the minister spoke, he also talked about the SMEs. We have people who are extremely creative on the African continent. They need support. They need support from within, and they need support from outside. If they succeed, we succeed as a continent. And they must succeed because Africa has to succeed. SMEs need two things that they don't find commonly. One is the seed capital to start. And second one is mentoring. You know, we have to realize that banks have a limitation. I'm not standing here to speak for banks. But there are other ways we can provide capital to these SMEs. But today's small companies can indeed and will in future become the big industrial companies that we need. So if we all team up hands to support the SMEs through various schemes, credit guarantee schemes, venture capital funds, it can help significantly to address the ultimate objective of job creation.
My question is, given the delicate state of play with Westminster politics, how important is it that Britain's engagement with Africa has very much an all-party perspective in that the major parties at least see the issues with similar eyes and also are committed to the engagement policy so that we have a degree of dependability?
Let me have a stab at these three. So the first one was a question about Westminster politics and the fragile nature of Westminster politics. I mean, it's a very interesting question. It's not one that's been posed a great deal. My suspicion is that Africa is not a particularly contentious political issue in Westminster. I don't feel that there's a strong disagreement between the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Conservatives, the SNP when it comes to Africa, partly because basically the absolute core of what the British government is doing in Africa, certainly in financial terms, is of course international development. We're spending $4.2 billion a year in Africa on international development. We're an international development, effectively, superpower. It dwarfs the other investments that we're making, and that is a very strong cross-party consensus around that investment in development and humanitarian assistance. And as for the more national security-related objectives, prosperity, security, migration, again, it would be difficult to believe that there would be much disagreement from other political parties about those things. I think there is potentially a question as different African countries go on different trajectories about how we get the balance right in our attitude, particularly towards issues such as democratization and human rights. And I think that is a very difficult issue, and it's not an issue which is really a cross-party issue. It's an issue that the British government has struggled with in Africa really for 60 years. And you can often find British foreign policy in Africa lurching every decade in a particular country between taking a extremely pragmatic, hyper-realist view to taking a hyper-idealistic view and then immediately reversing and going back in the other direction. These things partly reflect not just a sense of what we feel we ought to do in these countries, but also what we can do, and a sense of what kind of influence we really have and how the world is changing, how much anybody is really interested in responding and what they might respond to.
I guess my question is for Mr. Elumelu. Thank you for the very key points that you raised. They were very, very valid. I guess you made a point about investing in infrastructure, foreign investments in infrastructure, and electricity and power being the major driver of change in the next however many years. So my question is, how do we engage and encourage venture capitalists, private equity investors to consider infrastructure? Because right now, it's actually something that they don't look at all because of the risk and the time and everything.
We have a full infrastructure team within CDC looking to do that, and I have a number of different funds trying to do infrastructure. If you look at the billions of dollars that are decked against trying to make infrastructure work, against the number of projects that get through to bankable feasibility every year, something is going wrong. And I put that down to what I would call friction in the roundest sense as to how do you get capital to work and how, if you can do that efficiently, you do get to good returns. So I think in infrastructure, one of the things we've got to do is listen and challenge some of the established business models. And in the power sector, one of those issues is transmission and distribution. and how do we get that to be sustainable again so that the generators can be paid? These are big, complicated issues. And how do we enable or encourage individual businesses to get around some of those problems? One of the investments that I have through one of my funds in Nigeria, we keep coming back to Nigeria, is a very, very interesting generation business that's operating within the city of Lagos or within Lagos State, and how it has been enabled through some inspirational legislation and governance at the Lagos State level to supply power directly to some of the customers who then pay it directly. These are the models which you start with to generate success. The second one was on all of the, what I would call broader, I'm going to thank Mr. MacLeod for raising the questions, issues of land title, how that improves banking and how you get access to security, labour laws, transparency generally, and courts. I think it's a fact that most of the investments that pass through my desk probably end up with arbitration being done outside of the country. I'm sure that was the case 30, 40 years ago. It's still the case today. How do we create capacity within the court system to enable these things to happen? So I think one of the ways we can best do this, again, because these are big, big issues, I think it's just how do you introduce storytelling and transparency to create the government, to create commitment at government level to fixing the problem. And so we need lots better stories as to how do you do that, as opposed to individually try and fix one element. You need the whole system working with you to fix it.